You're listening to WRUU LP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, community radio with a global soul. Also streaming online at savsoundings.org. That's SAVSOUNDINGS.org.
Check, check, 1, 2. Look like a little country. Some rock and roll and blues. 'Cause we sure love playing for good people like you. Let me know if you can hear me. Check, check, 1, 2.
Welcome to Music Local and Sustainable, the radio show that features discussions with and the music of local musicians. I am your host, Dave Lake. Tonight, we are continuing our discussion with Howard Paul, President and CEO of Benedetto Guitars, at the Benedetto Guitar Workshop. So what makes a Benedetto guitar different from the average jazz guitar?
There are a lot of differences. Probably first and foremost is the artisanship and the attention to detail, and the fact that we still build these things mostly by hand. Most even jazz guitar companies are largely automated. And if they're not automated, if it's one guy building the guitars, they probably don't have nearly the experience or the fixtures to do what we're able to do in a little bit bigger scale. The second most important thing is materials. We are very selective. Just to give you an example, the maple that we use for the back of these instruments, the trees aren't wide enough to use one wide sheet to make an arched back. So it takes two sheets joined together, or two billets of wood joined together and then carved into a very thin arched plate. Those two pieces of wood have to be air dried for 5 years before they leave Europe, so that they're stabilized. You don't want any sap pockets in them, you don't want any moisture in them, you want them very, very dry and very stable for a long period of time. And then we receive them and we stick them in a drying room at 95 to 100 degrees with 20% humidity for another 3 to 5 years at least, as they continue to cure and be ready. This is before we do anything to them. So about 10 years in a very dry environment, curing them before they're ready to begin carving. And those two pieces of wood, takes two pieces to make one back, just for the back cost us between $450 and $600 a set. So it's maybe $600 invested in inventory that we can't touch for 5 years. Then we bring it out and we begin to carve it. And we're carving it. We start it with a machine. We eventually get it to a certain thickness, and then it's carved by hand from there. So we'll do all that early carving on a machine, and then we'll set it aside for another couple of years, often. And then bring it back down when we've decided which guitar that particular back is going to be most suited for, based on the acoustic and electric quality that we want from that instrument. And then we start carving it by hand, and it may be 20 hours of carving by our most highly skilled craftsman, who for the last 48 years was Bob Benedetto, and now it's Bob's apprentice who's worked under Bob for the last 8 years, Damon Milan. So the most expensive labor we have in this entire shop is the guy that's meticulously carving the top and the back of the instrument. Everybody else in the shop, they're dedicated to making the component parts that are suitable for that top and that back. Once the guitar is assembled, the finish process alone is a 2-month finish process using nitrocellulose lacquer, which is illegal to even use in California anymore. But we can use it in the state of Georgia in small quantities. It's got to be properly filtered. People have to have the right masks. It's got to be in an explosion-proof environment. It's very difficult to work with, but it's the very best material for acoustic archtop guitars that allows the wood to expand and contract and resonate, but still puts a high gloss protective finish on the instrument. So just that part is a 2-month process of expensive labor and expensive inventory sitting around for a long period of time, all going to make a final product that's got to be flawless in every respect. Musical instrument manufacturers don't work like that anymore. It's very expensive You have to charge a lot for the instrument. The employees are expensive. Anything in this country is expensive. So people who make instruments like this don't do it in the United States anymore. They do it in China, they do it in South Korea, they do it in Vietnam. To some extent, they do it in Japan, although that's gotten too expensive too. So it's almost unheard of to have this style of instrument made by hand in the United States. It's prohibitively expensive, which is why these guitars are very expensive. Even our least expensive laminated guitars, which have less expensive materials and less expensive labor, the finish process is the same, the components are still the same, the frets are still the same. So it still takes 8 months to build one, even though it's a little less expensive to build. It's the same finish and the same finish process. So nobody does that anymore. It's a level of artisanship that's kind of from a bygone era. Today, you can carve the top and the back in a computer numerically controlled machine and get the same dimensions, but not knowing how the wood's going to respond, you may not want the same dimensions. What sets us apart from everybody else is that dedication to tradition and to quality of work and to consistency of sound in a world of very inconsistent materials.
I think it was a headpiece I was looking at and saw the levels of lamination that
Yes.
you did.
Mm-hmm.
It was exquisite.
Yeah, I think the one you looked at was a Manhattan model or a Cremona model, and it's 11 unique layers of black, white, black binding that may be pieces of maple and ebony at some levels of that, and you can only bend it so much, so you have to miter cut every one of those 11 layers to join it to the other 11 layers to make that tight 90-degree angle or 45-degree angle. And if you screw it up, you have to go back and cut 11 more layers and glue them on individually and miter cut them and then scrape them with a razor blade and make sure that it's very, very meticulous work. It's the same kind of effort that goes into building a $500,000 Patek Philippe watch or a Lamborghini. That's what it takes, and so that's what you do. And it's not the most profitable business in the world, I can promise you that. It's very hard to make a go of a company like this. But I and Bob Benedetto and people who are invested in this company think it's worth dedicating ourselves to. And the people who buy these instruments recognize how fortunate they are to have something that's still built like this. It's a rarity in this modern age of manufacturing and import. I don't want to say junk because it's not all junk, but cheap imports are cheap imports. And while many other companies copy Bob Benedetto's design, he literally wrote the book in 1992, Making an Archtop Guitar. Well, almost even the independent builders around the United States credit Bob with the design and build things that Bob created or designed initially. It's all still imitation, and this is the one place where you can buy something that's truly authentic and handmade. That's kind of why we do it. And you know the difference when you pick it up, and you know the difference when you hear it.
Just looking at them, it's a work of art.
They are works of art. A lot of people buy them as works of art. Many of our customers don't play guitar. Not many of them, but there are quite a few that buy these because they recognize them for what they are. Unique artisanship and works of art.
The Stradivarius of jazz guitars.
We've been called that many times.
And you say that if you try to play one of these fine acoustic guitars very loud or amplify it very loud, you get a lot of feedback?
There's always a struggle. The better acoustic quality an instrument has, the more potential for feedback. And what feedback is having and you can hear it a little bit while we're talking in this room filled with guitars, you hear a little bit of echo. Feedback is having that top set in motion by something other than plucking on a string. So it stands to reason if you're playing a G note on a guitar and it's being pumped through a speaker at 3 or 4 times the volume, when that note resonates back and hits the top of the guitar, it sets it in motion the same way plucking a note would set it in motion. If other strings on the guitar aren't muted, then setting the top in motion sets the bridge in motion, setting the bridge in motion sets the string in motion, setting the strings in motion allows the pickup to amplify the sound and send it back through the speaker, and it creates this cycle. So the better the acoustic quality and the more resonant and lively the top, the more difficult to control at higher volumes. And so for jazz guitars, it's always been some level of compromise. How acoustic do you need your instrument to be, and how electric do you need it to be? And part of that's technique, part of it's what strings you use, part of it's where you place your amplifier, part of it's the instrumentation that you play surrounded by. And it's a very different playing a guitar acoustically with a singer than it is playing guitar with a B3 organ and a drummer, or playing a guitar with an 18-piece orchestra, or playing guitar with a 9-foot grand piano and an upright bass. All of those instrumentations will create different sound waves that can set the top in motion, and all of them may require a different level of compromise as to what instrument you use when you go on a gig.
That's a very interesting point. Could we compare the way you set it up and when you, say, recorded with Tony Monaco versus when you set it up and you record with a piano player like Bob
James? Sure. When I'm playing with just a piano, I'm looking for much more acoustic quality of sound, maybe a little purer sound. When I set up to record, I record the same way regardless, because when you're in a modern studio these days, you're in isolation. And the reason for the isolation is exactly that. You don't want the mics picking up the resonant sound of those other instruments, but you don't want your instrument picking up those harmonic overtones of other instruments and setting it in motion. So typically when I'm in a studio, I'm playing the most acoustically superior guitar I can play that can be properly amplified. And I'll run a line from the guitar, from the pickup, into an amplifier, and then take a direct line into the mixing board. And then I'll run a line from the guitar into the amplifier and let a microphone pick up what the amplifier's producing. And then I'll have a third line that's maybe a condenser mic over the strings to pick up the natural sound of the guitar without any amplification. So typically, if most jazz guitarists do this, they're trying to capture 3 signals. The signal directly from the guitar, the signal from the amp, and then the direct line in so that the power amplifier of the mixing board can hear just the pickup and not the acoustic sound of the guitar. And then a good engineer will figure out what the natural sound is of those 3 and pick out the best frequencies and blend it. And it's always a challenge because the engineer may not hear the same thing that I hear. And that's the case if I listen to the Bob James recording we did. As much as I enjoy it, that's not the sound that I heard when I played the guitar. That was an engineer's idea of what my guitar should sound like after he has those 3 signals to mix.
Let's listen to the Hoagy Carmichael tune, Georgia on My Mind, from the Just Friends sessions featuring Bob James on the piano and Howard Paul on his Benedetto guitar.
So it's always a little bit of a challenge in picking the right instrument. Ideally, you have one instrument that you use everything for, and then you adjust your environment a little bit around you. But not all guitarists have that option. A lot of guys go on stage and they need 5 or 6 instruments because they're playing 5 or 6 different types of music, and everybody else is changing. A keyboard player may be using a Fender Rhodes 1 minute and a B3 the next and a piano the next, and all those things affect your instrument differently. So the guitarists will switch instruments. I'm lucky enough to kind of pick my gigs and pick my accompanist and know when I start playing with one particular musical combo that it's going to stay that combo from the beginning of the recording session to the end of the recording session.
Now, when they're mixing the tracks at the end, do you have much input into that?
Yeah, I have some input. I kind of can isolate and say I want my guitar to sound a little warmer, a little rounder, but frankly, garbage in, garbage out. So you've got to give them the signal to work with in order to get the signal that you hear in the end. In Bob James's case, Bob is the master. He owns his own record label, Tappan Zee. He was the director, artist representative, and producer for C. Taylor Records for years. Discovered some of the greatest names in jazz, from George Benson to Grover Washington. Who knows who he discovered over the course of his career. Unbelievable career. And he's hundreds of albums and produced most of them and owns his own recording studio. So what I'm going to, once we finished recording and we go into the engineering room and I'm standing next to Bob James, I'm deferring to Bob James. And if the engineer's smart, he's deferring to Bob James as well, because he knows what he wants to hear and he's got tremendous success in achieving that sound. At least the consumer thinks so, because they bought a lot of his records. So there's a point where, as a musician, once the record's made, it becomes a commercial thing. It's no longer a musical thing. And you have to step away from it and let those people take control over whatever they're going to do with it. And you lose some artistic license over it, but that's the nature of making a record, I guess.
So from the Bob James album, what best shows the qualities of the Benedetto guitar?
Well, I haven't listened to it in a long time. Probably Just Friends, Autumn Leaves, or Alone Together.
Here is Autumn Leaves. Now everyone in Savannah thinks Autumn Leaves was written by Johnny Mercer. Well, Johnny Mercer did write the English lyrics, but the music here is composed by Joseph Kozma, with Bob James on piano and Howard Paul on the Benedetto guitar.